Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Middle West podcast. I'm your host, Thaqib Musa. Assalamu alaikum. And I'm joined by my co-host, Jahangir Badr.
Assalamu alaikum.
And our guest co-host, Malik Shatri.
Assalamu alaikum.
We're in lovely Manchester today. It's far from lovely. But we're talking, we're having a round table today discussing some of the things about the past few episodes, but also trying to tie that back to British Muslims and what it's been like. So we just did an episode on Kashmir. We brought an activist from Kashmir around, and I think we got a little bit of the laydown of the situation there right now with a complete lockdown, with some use of pellet guns and other questionable means, torture and things like that. And what we wanted to focus on today is how do you relate it back to the UK? And I think the first question that comes to it is really as a British Muslim, especially if you're not from an immigrant background and you don't have any connection to Kashmir or Pakistan, India / that region, why should you care about this? What relevance does it really hold to us as Muslims living in a British context?
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Allahumma adfa'na bima 'allamtana wa 'allimna ma yanfa'una wa zidna 'ilman wa fahma. It's a very good question, and one that people don't realize how the people who perceive it to be relevant, for them I would say it's not as relevant as you think, or not relevant in the same way you think. And for the people who think it's irrelevant, it is more relevant than they think. And I'll explain what I mean. This is just my personal opinion. The people who think typically a Muslim youth brought up in the UK that I don't care, why is it to me? The first thing to realize is that what goes around comes around. Before someone being a Muslim, before someone having cultural ties to you, the fact that a human being has suffered injustice, as a Muslim, being someone who is upright and fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and feels this obligation to pursue justice and truth wherever it is, that's it. An injustice on a human being is an injustice on yourself. And if you don't perceive this to be the case and you don't do anything about it, there will inevitably come a day when you will suffer injustice. So this is the first point. And then the second one, of course, fellow brothers and sisters, Muslim suffering, but then there's other things you can say with regards to that. And with regards to the people who do care, the reason why I said what I said initially is that often people do it because of nationalistic reasons, because of reasons which are not right or wrong, but they are not the ideal reason that you should have as a Muslim, who, first of all, you should, again, founded on the first point of the love of justice as opposed to just the love of sorting your own people out. Even Hadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he says, "Unsur akhaka zaliman aw madhluman," like give victory or give help your brother out, whether he's an oppressor or oppressed. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, of course, asked him, we could help him out if he's oppressed. What if he's the oppressor? He said, you stop him. So,
I think that's a very good kind of point from a general perspective, is that we need to care about human rights and things like that. But what about, what in specific about this issue, which is kind of, and I appreciate it for some people who are from a Kashmir background or part of the diaspora. Of course, this is very close to home. But for a lot of others, close to home is actually things like there's a lot of oppression happening in the UK,
Exactly, yes.
So we should channel that energy into taking down BJ.
Well, I think it's the element of even acknowledging it. I think there's some people that don't even want to acknowledge what's even happening. I think I don't even want to know. Okay, it's happening somewhere 3,000 miles away. That's their problem. I think what Malik is actually saying is that having that concern, number one, is actually a sign of your iman as well. If you're not even concerned, then there's a problem. But obviously, once you're concerned, how much of an impact you can have, that's a different question altogether, and I'm sure we can discuss that as we go on. But I think the primary point is that as Muslims, we have to be concerned, and I think there's also a narration from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is to the effect that whoever does not care for the affairs of the believers, then he is not from us. Okay, so having this mindset and this mentality that wherever the believers are on this globe, irrespective of how far they are, I'm concerned about their affair and I want to know what's happening. And if there's anything I can do to help...
Do you think we have a disproportionate kind of effect or kind of disproportionate amount of concern to things happening abroad rather than having a... Because, one of the things is, for example, a lot of the money, and Muslims are, per capita, we punch above our weight in terms of giving charity. But a lot of it goes abroad to conflicts happening abroad. And there's an argument to be made that actually maybe we need to have a concern for ourselves and some kind of strategic thinking in terms of what we do here.
I don't think it's a case of either or kind of thing. Both can be done. And I think something that we really have to understand is that these conflicts and these issues and these acts of oppression, they hit really close to home, because obviously we have that bond of iman with them. But for many people living in this country, it is actually family that is actually suffering. So it's not something that's really far away kind of thing. So in that sense, there is definitely a rational reason why a lot of our charity goes abroad.
I agree partially to that. I will say, though, from my opinion, wallahu a'lam, I believe you are right, Thaqib, in that a disproportionately large and significant amount goes to places which we can't really change. We can help, we can alleviate. A lot of it is an emotional phenomenon whereby it makes us feel good to know that we spent millions and billions abroad. But realistically, is zakat based on just spending money on causes, or is it serving the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way which Allah has defined? Alleviating poverty can fall under it. Helping people in various forms can fall under it. But fundamentally, zakat is first and foremost directed at the community in which it is taken from. When Rasulullah sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen, he said, تُؤْخَذُ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ وَتُرَدُّ إِلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ, taken from their rich and given to their poor. Their rich and their poor in the UK context, I would agree it's to alleviate problems here. There is an argument which is that you have what's called relative poverty in the UK, whereas you have absolute poverty in places such as Kashmir, Yemen. Of course, the suffering is disproportionately greater. But then again, is zakat for the alleviation of poverty and suffering, or is it to further the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by establishing Islam or trying to establish, Islam and justice and, a society pretty much in the place you are living, and then having a society which is incapable of going and helping out people abroad? Because right now, my perception of a lot of our fundraising and charity is more, it's just paracetamol to temporary...
And that's literally what I think. Like we have a big Band-Aid approach, so we'll give them food, but actually, it's that whole thing of, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish. I know this makes me sound very, very Tory of saying, these people need to pull their socks up. But kind of in terms of like, where's the long-term thinking and strategy in the charity work that we do? Even here, it's not just about, giving rice and stuff to people who are in relative poverty. It's
empowering.
Yeah.
No, I agree with 110%, to be honest. I mean, strategy is incredibly important, and the way charity organizations operate do need to have a certain element of introspection and see where they're actually going wrong. But I think, irrespective of that, people will always have, as you said, that emotional connection is there. And it's much easier to give to a cause where you see a person actually starving than to, as you said, trying to build a community, which is a much harder sell, to be honest.
But isn't that a little bit emotional? Like, we seem to be very emotionally driven in our kind of decision making, and the other thing is that we seem to be in a very confusing place with our kind of is home here or home there. And I know we've had a couple of podcasts devoted to
a good couple of podcasts on that, haven't we?
Yeah, and we still haven't resolved. But I think that it just takes time to resolve that.
Identity crises.
Yeah. Plus, our in-house socialist isn't here to talk about.
Shout out to Asad.
Shout out to Asad. So that's from a charity perspective, but also from a like, I think the amount of political attention that we give to the foreign policy rather than to issues that concern us. So there's a lot of campaigns I've seen that are kind of talking about Palestine, that are talking about Kashmir, and of course they're in their rightful place. They're very important. But how many Muslims are actually concerned about the NHS which I would argue hits us harder on a regular basis. And actually, even if we make that charity argument, is that if you're going to have to spend money on health insurance in this country, clearly you will have less disposable income to send it back home to wherever, even if that was a kind of, setting aside that point of how much of our money goes abroad. And we need to kind of focus on bringing that more to the forefront.
Like I said, I completely agree with that point, that we have to have a certain amount of focus here. But the point I was making is that people have an emotional connection and a familial connection with people in those countries. Like if you have family in Kashmir and you are getting regular updates of them being beaten, of them being tortured, of people in your village being raped, I think
in proportion,
your concern, your priority is going to be them. It's not going to be the NHS. You understand?
Yeah, but isn't that a very short-term thing? Because if the NHS is gone for you, that means eventually you'll have less money to send back to them. And yes, this is an urgent priority. And I'm specifically, I'm not talking about people who are Kashmiri. I think if you have a direct relation to the issue at hand, and this doesn't just apply to Kashmir, this applies to all of them, is that if you have a direct connection to the issue at hand, one of the things that you could argue is that actually in our global society, your local community, you might be better placed to actually give charity back home rather than here, because you don't have as deep ties, and maybe you have more family over there who are given. And with that statement that comes in al-aqrabuna awla bil ma'ruf, that the closer ones to you are first to be
to the right,
first deserving of good things. That could apply not to the people who are geographically close to you, your neighbors that you talk to once a year. Rather, it's your relatives who live abroad. And I see that point in terms of family, but I do think in terms of attention, we have I think it's not either or. It's kind of a proportional thing, but I think we severely seem to neglect the local side of it.
That's the key word, proportional. I mean, being able to divide our time and our resources effectively is where we need to draw our attention to, and how we do that, I think, is where the discussion needs to be at, to be honest.
I think we can all agree that as Muslims, we often suffer from what's called selective outrage, where certain issues will cause us more distress than others, even though both are equally horrendous. That's the first point. With regards to, a good example is the issue of Yemen. Now, Yemen's been going on for quite some time now. It's actually the worst humanitarian crisis since a long time, maybe World War II, possibly. This is a very good example of how we as Muslims, because we've been focusing so much on appeasing ourselves through knowing that we donated, some food, some rice bags, some water, some medicines. However, if Muslims had more of a unity here at home, maybe we could have pressured the government more to stop their hypocrisy with regards to their foreign policy. In fact, stopping the UK government, for example, from selling arms would have caused way more good to the people of Yemen and the children of Yemen than all the millions that we send in food to feed them after the bombs and the crops had been, destroyed.
So we're chasing our own tail. We just run around sending this aid after something happens, and we don't
waiting for things to happen before we just come in just to alleviate some of the symptoms to make ourselves feel good. I think this reactiveness that we suffer from as a community, possibly due to a lack of leadership and to a lack of clear strategy amongst Muslim elders, Muslim youth overall, I think in the long term we will suffer far greater calamities than we could currently envisage.
But kind of this is a tangent coming from the selective outrage thing. Do you think the Kashmir issue has a problem with selective outrage? Because Palestine is something that the community all seem to galvanize around. But I get the impression with Kashmir it's not the same. A lot of people still view it as a regional issue and not an Islamic or pan-Islamic issue, which I think is a big problem. And I don't know if you've had the same observation, that especially if you're not from the Indo-Pak region, or even if you're from India, not Pakistan, you don't take the same view on the Kashmir crisis, that it's an issue fundamentally of Muslims wanting their autonomy from a majority Hindu state, which claims to be secular, but does not afford the same rights and.
From my experience, to be honest, from my conversations with people from different ethnicities and backgrounds, everyone seems to think that this is a similar situation to the Palestinians. To be honest, I don't know. I've never met anyone who's actually said that to me. That no, I feel that this issue is a specifically regional issue, and that's it. Is their problem. Personally, I've not come across such people. I don't know if you have yourself.
Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of Arabs seem to think that there's a common misconception that Pakistan got their independence from, and it was only like 2 weeks. Yeah, 14th of August. That like Independence Day was celebrated. A lot of people have the impression that Pakistan got its independence from India rather than from Britain, but also amongst Indian Muslims, where they're in a very interesting. I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between them and British Muslims. In terms of their identities are constantly threatened. I found out recently that actually the bit of Kashmir that we refer to as Azad Kashmir, and I think we mentioned this in the past in the last episode of it's referred to as Pakistan occupied Kashmir in India, which I found very interesting. Is they very much within Indian media they've given a spin to it that this whole thing and this whole move of kind of capturing Kashmir and forcibly making it a part of India is more about development than it is about ethnic control and basically doing what Israel did in the West Bank.
Possibly.
Yeah. So I kind of.
I think there are parallels, especially considering that the Israel-Palestine issue formally started in 1948, and the partition of India was pretty much around about the same time.
So 47, which basically they're both products of British colonial retreat. Yeah. We don't have enough money, and so we're gonna just let these brown people sort their
fend for themselves.
Yeah, and left kind of
a vacuum.
Isn't it?
Flashpoint.
1945 is when Pakistan.
47.
1927.
47.
No. Is it?
You're such a bad Pakistani. My God, what if
all the years off? Sorry. So 1947, then 1948 was India.
I thought you were going to say 1947, and then 1945 is when I was like 47. 45 is when the war ended.
Yeah.
47, Pakistan and India both got independence same time.
48
is when Israel got its independence and the first Nakba happened.
That's true.
The India one is very interesting because they were both going to get it at midnight on August 15th, 1947, and the Pakistanis moved it back by 1 hour so that it would be 14th of August, so that there's different independence days. And there's a lot of kind of history to how that happened and partition and whether or not the Muslims should have had a separate state. I think if you lie on the Indian side of it, the Muslims feel that actually if we stayed together as a bloc, it would have been better. And on the Pakistani side, people say that there's no chance that we could have survived together in a democracy with such a big Hindu majority. And they use the current government as a kind of a proof that look, it couldn't happen because people like Modi come to power.
Even though the current government sort of also feeds off the fact that independence and they're the Muslims and we are the Hindus.
Yes, so the current government really believes that.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at the left wing in India, the Congress Party, they're very kind of
multiculturalism.
Exactly, they're kind of the same kind of left wing stuff that we have here, which is why we've formed alliances with the left. And that brings me on to my second question of kind of long-termism. I don't know if it's my second because I've asked like 15 questions already. But when I think Muslims in this country seem to have allied predominantly with the left wing, and I think in terms of the politics of that, I'm not sure if that's the right way to go long term because I don't know if either of you are active in politics and get involved with this, but generally Muslims tend to go with Labour, and most Muslims tend to be safe Labour voters, unless they have selfish reasons for voting Conservative. But there are a lot of basically landlordism and that kind of thing, which isn't necessarily bad. But the other thing is that there's a lot of ideas on the right wing from a social perspective that actually agree with us. And there was a lot of like this Parkfield school and those types of things that are happening where Muslims are actually doing what right-wing schools do.
I think the real question is what is the primary reason why Muslims either join the right or left? Why do they join, or why do they vote for Labour or Conservatives? What's the primary motivator?
I think in practice it's to get this annoying pesky activist off your lawn, because people come canvassing and then you go there.
I think it's self-interest most of the time. If I'm rich, typically, I would vote for...
Is that wrong? In a democracy, isn't self-interest a fine motivator for your...
Yeah, so the point I'm making is that most voters are not ideological voters. Most Muslims don't vote Labour because they've read the Labour manifesto, etc., and they're 100% in agreement with its outlook, etc.
Apart from the few people who think Corbyn will be the next Khalifa.
Yeah, apart from those miskin people, yeah. But the majority of people know. And what seems to be the case is that majority of Muslims actually happen to live in safe Labour areas.
Yeah.
And what I personally think is that the main factor in the way people vote is economical. Is based upon their financial situation rather than what they actually believe. This just seems to be from what I've seen.
I could agree to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the argument of left and right, it doesn't really affect most voters, because most voters don't know what you're talking about when you say left wing and right wing and stuff like that. They basically, majority of them look at policies.
Very interestingly that you used your right hand to say left wing and your left hand to say right wing.
It's a podcast, so they don't know. So yeah, I mean, most people vote based upon policies, or maybe based upon the individual who is standing. Very few people are ideologically like that. Like, I am left wing and that's it, or I'm right wing and that's it. So apart from the new millennials that are coming up,
I agree with
who seem to be.
I think the people who are very active in politics, they're the ones who spend hours and hours researching manifestos and coming up with views. But even in the self-interest perspective, I think a lot of Muslims are inclined to the left wing because they see that, as a kind of left wing or left wing leaders are usually more kind of on it with the diversity and things like that, whereas the right wing takes the more.
I don't even think it's the diversity. I think it's more of the welfare society, the government giving benefits and stuff like that. That seems to be more of a factor than multiculturalism and all of this, because most of these Muslims actually live in areas which are predominantly Muslim anyway, so they don't really care. To do with this multicultural. I think all of that and that discourse is at a much higher level than most people are actually interested in. When David Cameron, as we talked about in previous episodes, talking about multiculturalism is dead, most people probably didn't even understand that statement within our community. Let's be honest.
If they assume they were bothered enough to watch
most people probably didn't even hear that statement.
I think that's probably more true, because they don't care.
They're watching Geo News instead.
Exactly, because they're watching Pakistani politics or Arab, or they're watching Al Jazeera instead. Yeah, because they didn't even watch David Cameron, because even though they live here and have their money here and their assets here and their kids live here and go to school here, and they use the NHS, they're worried more about back home politics.
True.
And that's the kind of dangerous level of short-termism that I'm talking about, that we millennials need to come in and fix these old people up and tell them all.
I think the danger with
Geo News.
The millennials is the aspect I was indicating towards, is that they have become very ideological. Okay, and you can actually see this on university campuses, etc., where people are now fully invested in the left, and they associate 100% with the left, and the left is what guides their principles and their morals, etc., and that becomes very dangerous as well.
So I think what tends to happen with that is when you become so invested in the left wing, then you start imbibing left wing ideologies or policies that aren't necessarily even in your own self-interest, and that's why we have a kind of rise in all of these kind of acceptance of various things that are not permitted in the faith, and so kind of the kind of LGBT marches and things like that. And there's a big thing in London where few people were. I think there was a poster in particular that really got me, which said Allah is gay and loves you, or something like that. And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. You've been involved in a lot of.
Malik is looking at you thinking, what kind of podcast is this? How did you make a quick exit?
I think coming back to a previous point you made, I think, subhanAllah, it's a hadith we learn as children.
Couldn't handle the heat.
Trying to move the conversation a bit more to the halal side. I think this hadith that we learn, I'm sure all of us learned it or first heard it as children, where the Prophet ﷺ says, it's muttafaqun alayhi, he says, لا زال جبريل يوصيني بالجار حتى ظننت أنه يورثه. Jibreel kept on telling me again and again and again about my neighbor, until he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, thought that Jibreel was going to make the neighbor inherit his money. So I think, yes, family is important. You might have family in Kashmir, in Syria, in Palestine, in Yemen, back home, wherever that home may be, your parents' home may be. But I think it's important to know that as a Muslim, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, sent to people. And I think that is the main thing that we've forgotten. To be Muslim is not to live for yourself and for your family. It's actually to share this message of Islam with everyone else. And how are you going to share it with people who you have no concern for? So I think being in the UK is an opportunity, and we've not really perceived it as an opportunity. We've came here just to escape injustices at home, maybe because there was more work and more opportunities here. I think if we shed more light on this aspect of Islam, specifically that we have a mission, we have a vision, we have values, we have a purpose in life. We're not just people who are parasites and go anywhere in the world.
Yeah, so I think that's very, very important about what's really important to us, and I think neighbors have a big right that you talked about. But when like the fact that so many Muslims live in Muslim-only areas and they've never engaged with non-Muslims and kind of gone out and about and engaged with the wider community, and I think that's another example of short-termism, is that if we want to campaign against Islamophobia and things like that, we can't do it by being in isolated bubbles of society.
And I think if someone doesn't really have a concern for his neighbour, then I don't trust that he's going to have a concern for his country, whether here or back home. I can't really trust that he's going to have a concern for a greater number of people if he's failing this basic right which a Muslim ought to impart upon his direct, immediate community. It's another phenomenon which we have in the Muslim community, whereby we think we can go and save the world. We can't even save our own neighborhood, let alone our own families sometimes, let alone our own selves. I mean, as many scholars always say, or imams in the masjid, if someone is struggling to, pray Fajr, for example, and give his rights to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then does he really have the basis and the foundation to go and, all these causes? I mean, it might sound good on paper, it might make him feel good, it might impress everyone, but again, his foundations are weak. He might be doing it out of nationalistic reasons, out of other reasons, leftist reasons, rightist reasons, whatever exists. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a manhaj, a formula of doing things. We don't do things based on what people will say or to appease people or for fame. We do things generally because we believe we're going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think if we were more rooted in this concept of وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, these two fundamentals, al-birr wa-taqwa, I think we would be in a much better position, not only as far as a static position is concerned, but the direction that we're heading in. And we will be in a very different shape to what is the case today, internationally as well as locally in the UK.
But what does that mean practically? So yeah, if we're rooted in a more ta'awun bil birri wa taqwa aspect, but what practically does that change in the actions that we do? Because don't we see a lot of organizations already going out there doing that, or a lot of mosques already going out there doing that?
Doing what?
تعاونين على البر والتقوى.
So let's define it. What is this? What is it that they're doing? Because I've not really seen. Okay.
What do you expect them to do?
Okay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the second ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah. Yeah. And Allah talks about it Allah mentions the ayah in context to the mushrikeen. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنْآنُ قَوْمٍ. The people who stopped them from, the mushrikeen, the polytheists, who stopped them from coming to, perform in Mecca. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ, don't let this stop you from أَن تَعْتَدُوا, to transgress. Even though you've been oppressed, don't oppress someone. And instead, he gives us the alternative. So don't do this, which is oppression. Instead, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, and enjoin in al-birr, which is often translated as, piety or fidelity, maybe. taqwa and consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So causes that are, human causes that we could all agree on, whether you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, a leftist, a rightist, whatever, just a homeless person on the street, poverty, inequality, social causes of social justice. These issues we should, neighbors, for example, you would be surprised to know that loneliness is one of the biggest causes of, I think, depression or something in the UK, because people are living very antisocial lives. Antisocial does not just imply someone going and breaking windows. Antisocial also means someone, a pensioner, just at home with no family, really. So as Muslims, we have a big role to play, which we are yet to discover how much of an impact we can do just by being Muslims, just by doing this, again, the neighbor issue, for example, or just by being someone who, regularly visits, I don't know if there's any orphanages or care homes, or there's so many opportunities. And in fact, when we see problems in society, we should see this as a good thing, in the sense that it's an opportunity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has caused evil to exist such that good can manifest itself. If problems never existed, then you could say religion or causes of good people, these things would be redundant. So again, it's focusing more on a less reactionary, more proactive role, founded in, again, al-birr wa taqwa, in consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to do instead of going what you think is right. Yes, for example, Syria and Yemen and Kashmir, these places deserve a concern. As Jahangir started off with at the very beginning, if we don't have a concern for them, then our iman could be at stake, really. But at the same time, a concern does not necessarily translate into action that you could do right then. And I think if the concern was to also be given a weight and a regard here, it will shift the dynamics of how we think and what we do also.
Yeah, I kind of I think we moved into some abstracts, but there's a lot of stuff in there that was practical that can be implemented. I had a few kind of pointers that were that I wanted to get through today, and one of them possibly the last one, looking at the time, was the concept of, we talked about a lot of a large proportion of our society feel that that back home they're very tied into their communities back in whatever country they came from, and it's only in the second, third generation or millennials at the moment where we see this kind of. There was a few waves of immigration to the UK, and a lot of the people who are Muslim and today tend to be second or third generation immigrants, which means that whatever back home was is less important to them, and they feel more rooted down here. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of mosques, a lot of organizations, a lot of Muslim kind of groups are very much kind of founded based on those ethnic groupings. And now that we're in a kind of where we're reaching a level where a large proportion of our community might not actually care that much about that, or they might feel more British than they do their home country. How do we work to kind of using that and make our organizations reflect that more? So how do we bring people from all of these different ethnic backgrounds together, and make a more cohesive British community and mosques, etc., that actually reflect that cohesiveness? Because it's coming, and we should get ahead of the trend. Youth our age and younger, especially younger than us, they don't really care which back home their grandparents or great grandparents came from.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back and try to understand why such division exists within the Muslim community, I think we would see that it's actually mainly down to the language barrier, where I'm sure our elders thought and were of the view that to cater for each community, it would be better to set up institutions that would directly benefit them. But as you said, that no longer exists, or especially with the new generations. We all speak the same language. We all share the same culture. We all share the same experiences. Therefore, I think institutions now have to start to reflect this generation. And I think it's only when young people come forward and start to take key positions that we'll be able to appreciate such changes being made in the community. So yeah.
Isn't that more of a kind of reactive approach of, when it happens, it'll happen, and then we'll...
No, I'm not saying when it happens. I'm saying that it is happening. In that case, when it happens, it is happening.
Because I think it's very important to accelerate that trend. I agree with you; it's happening to an extent in many places. With there's a rise in intercultural everything really, and
the first thing is that it's not a competition. It's not a race between us and the elders, and I think just as we need inspiration and guidance, they also need inspiration and guidance. So what we don't want to happen is an institution now only catering for the youth, if you understand what I mean. Because if our argument is at the moment that our institutions only cater for the elders, then what we don't want to do is be reactive and end up creating institutions that only cater for the youth. Because at the end of the day, everyone needs to be catered for. Everyone's needs need to be met. Everyone, as I said before, needs inspiration. Everyone needs to be learning. This deen is for everyone. It's not just for the youth. I know that we always emphasize the youth. But at the end of the day, those of us sitting around this table will be approaching 30 very soon, and suddenly 40 and 50, and we will be the elders.
Speak for yourself. I'm never turning 30.
You're never turning 30, yeah? But we will be the elders very soon, okay? And I'm sure we also want the institutions to cater for us as well at that age. So what we're saying is that the institutions maybe at the moment do not cater for everyone. And we want to see institutions that cater for everyone. So the change has to be organic, and I'm not on the same wavelength as Asad with the revolutionary type thinking, but it has to be organic, it has to be gradual, and it has to reflect the community. That's all I'm saying. Yeah,
these communists always want a revolution on their hands. Do you think a lot of the current organizations that are out there are well equipped enough to handle that change? Because I think structurally as well, we have a big split between, for example, representation in the Muslim community. We have so many different groups that are. I mean, if we speak about our two organizations, MAB and UKIM directly, they're very much divided amongst ethnic lines. And do you think they have the capacity to handle what's coming to them?
I
think you've been involved a lot more with FOSIS, where actually this happens very organically because it's students coming and going, and it tends to be a lot more diverse anyway. But holding on to those students afterwards is
I think if I'm going to draw my experiences from FOSIS, from local work in Manchester, being involved in mosques, being involved possibly, not directly, but indirectly, being aware of the scene of charities and youth work from an early age, I think most people lack direction. Again, a lot of the initiatives, they're good, they're needed, but we've become accustomed to very low standards. That's my personal take on it. I don't know if you would agree or disagree, but I think the fact that we have these standards and we think well of them is a testament to how low the standards have become. So, am I making sense, Aqib? You look a bit sort of...
I don't know, I lost you. I don't know why I pick up grammar errors. So I was just like, have become, and then I couldn't think of anything else.
Sheikh Zubair. Okay, let me rephrase this then. We've become accustomed, and forgive my skepticism, I'm not a negative person, I'm just trying to be a realist. We have become accustomed to standards which are very low, such that if we see an initiative in an organization and they do some work, we think it's so good. And it is good, alhamdulillah, but it only appears good just because there's no one else doing the same thing. So the standards have become sort of lower, especially compared to how the scene was, for example, the Muslim student scene 20, 30, 40 years ago, where you had leaders in the community of sorts. You had, the founding fathers of the masajid, of the schools and everything. They did their part, and now they're gone. And the people after them have more or less just accepted the standard set and maintained them, instead of trying to build on them. Which is why you could say, just to be a bit sort of bit of a history geek and quote Edward Gibbon, where he quotes the Roman Empire, and he says, Thaqib is looking very impressed, mashallah. He quotes to the nearest meaning that if an organization or an empire is not growing, if you're not growing, then that's it, you are in decline. You can't, there's no middle ground. So I think on the surface, yes, there might be organizations, there might be FOSIS, there might be youth and ISOCs and charities left, right and center, and these guys are doing work, and it's good work. But again, this good work, is it enough? Or is it just that it's good? Do we perceive it as good work? Because the real sort of superior work is yet to be seen. So it's just a matter of perspective, really. And it's dependent on your experiences that you've faced.
I think one of the things that you mentioned about kind of the standard was set, and then we're just kind of building on it. And sometimes I struggle to see a lot of really genuinely innovative work coming out of any of our. I mean, there's bits and bobs here and there who've done stuff that's actually genuinely different, but a lot of it seems to be the same old. Put on a conference here, do a camp there.
To be honest, I think in terms of an organization, innovation is difficult, and it takes a long time, because especially the bigger an organization gets, the less flexible it gets, and therefore new ideas and innovation take much longer. And what I personally think is that it is actually the role of organizations, especially like UKM and MAB, etc., to create individuals and to inspire and empower individuals to bring forward new ideas and to try out new projects, and give them that platform and the resources that they need to actually answer the challenges that the Muslim community is actually facing. But yeah, I mean, I agree with your point that we don't really see new things coming from either organization on a grand scale.
Do you think
you see projects here and there, but
do you think it's a problem of like our vision is too kind of narrow, and we're just seeing a slice of the Muslim community when we talk about these, and there's actually a lot of innovation happening in the peripheries in other places? Or
I think, as Malik said, you know what, within the whole Muslim community, I don't think there's much hassle. And I've not seen anything that I've looked at in the last 5 to 10 years that I say, wow, that's kind of amazing kind of thing. But in terms of our organizations, I think it's a similar thing. We are part of the Muslim community, and the Muslim community, as we can say, has stagnated, and it does need to be revived, and it does need fresh ideas to come forward.
It's a very you know what, it feels very appropriate just to kind of end on that terrible disappointment, but I think it's too negative of a thing. So I just wanted to end with, what do you guys think are the biggest, well, the single biggest problem / challenge facing the Muslim community in your periphery? Because I mean, both of you guys are involved in a very deep level with your local masajid, and obviously we're getting a slice because it's the Manchester community. But as Asad would say, nothing but the Great North matters. So what do you guys think is like one of the biggest problems or challenges that you've seen with the Muslim community?
I don't know how broad or specific you want to be, but the first thing I always think of is just a lack of Islam, a lack of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If someone, and let me sort of elaborate on this, if someone is in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he naturally has to go and learn, read the Quran, and find out what Allah wants him to do in the 21st century, in the place Allah has put him. And naturally this will lead on to things, this will lead on to some, innovation. Okay, is this organization or this message or this whatever it is doing what Allah wants us to do? It's a very it's easy to lead on from there. So I think what we lack the most in terms of like people or individuals are leaders who combine both a correct sort of firm rooted in Islamic sort of principles, you could say. He has sufficient knowledge, he has sufficient sort of experience, and also they have the responsibility of activism. So typically in the Muslim community we will have activists who are very knowledge deprived, and who don't really know what they're doing, or they're just doing what everyone else is doing. Just the difference is that they just happen to be Muslim. And you have people who have knowledge. They have the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah, things that are so relevant and they can be made relevant, but they stick to their own corners. And they sometimes make it irrelevant. And for them, Islam is just, the 5 salawat in your masjid, and that's it, your own bubble. So combining both of them are the main ingredients for the Muslim leadership that we need in the coming years. Allahu A'lam.
Jazakallah. That's a very essential. You'll have to top that off. Bismillah.
No, you know what? I was going to say actually something similar, but I think for me the major concern is how Muslims now go forward and reconcile their faith with their politics, and especially as I mentioned before, especially with the new generation coming up, who seem to be taking all of their morals and their principles from their politics or from their political affiliations that they have. And I think one of the reasons for that is we have not been able to, as a Muslim community, been able to produce any form of leadership in that area who we can look up to. And I think that's one of our main downfalls and main problems and main areas that need a lot of attention.
Jazakallah, I really appreciate that. Now, the good thing about being a host is I can get away with the...
No. Now we just temporarily take over.
I'm quite torn.
What do you think?
About two things. One is I think there's a lack of kind of learning from our history or literacy or even on the Quran. Like, we don't engage on a deeper level. We tend to, and it's extremely kind of flabbergasting to me that there are actually organizations out there who discourage active engagement with the Quran, and they have massive followings in the UK, and I just find that how can you not read the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also how can you not read your history and engage yourself deeper and just kind of let your mind sit through, and I speak to myself first and foremost, because Netflix is great, and British TV has these programs like Gogglebox where you just watch people watching TV. Like, what are we doing with our lives? And I think the second thing is the
question is, what are you doing with your life if you're watching that?
Exactly, and the lack of Britishness. So we tend to import a lot of our Islam and everything. We approach in a very different way to how we approach everything else, and that's one of the things that we seek to do with this podcast, is to bring the conversation back to Britain and hopefully highlight some of the future leaders that we have in Britain that will see how I just tied that back to the podcast. This is thinking.
That's why you're the host, huh?
I'm not just a pretty face, although I'm not a pretty face
or a pretty voice.
That's why we don't do video on this, because our listeners would just.
It's Zakir's fault.
But Jazakumullah khair for that. Inshallah, we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the Middle West. You can email us with your feedback, your comments, any suggestions for guests or topics that we should cover, anything interesting that's happened. Also, your thoughts on what we talked about today at themiddlewestpc@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at The Middle West. Facebook. You can find our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you find your podcast, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, anything. And follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, etc. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.